Growing up in poverty, Lamptey Williams was told that his dreams were impossible. When he said he wanted to be a pilot, everyone laughed. No money, no connections. Was his dream doomed from the start? But against all odds, he refused to give up. His journey was filled with struggles, unexpected mentors, and a final twist that left everyone speechless. The sun slowly sank behind the rows of old houses in suburban Atlanta, leaving the sky drenched in shades of crimson and amber. On the corrugated metal roof of a small, time-worn house, young Lamptey Williams lay on his back, hands folded beneath his head, eyes fixed on the airplanes gliding through the evening sky. Each time he caught the flickering lights from their fuselage, he imagined the cockpit, the place where one day he would sit, guiding the steel bird far beyond these worn-out streets. Below, the sharp hiss of bus brakes cut through the twilight as it halted in front of the house. Charles Williams, Lamptey's father, stepped down, his uniform faded from years of wear, his old shoes coated in the dust of long shifts. The moment he spotted his son perched atop the roof, he shook his head and called out, "Lamptey, get down this instant. If you fall, your mother will skin the both of us alive." His voice held no anger, just the familiar blend of exhaustion and love. Lamptey chuckled, nimbly slipping back inside through the window. Cynthia, his mother, stood by the kitchen doorway, her gaze filled with quiet reproach. Still, she handed him a freshly made sandwich. "How many times have I told you? Stop climbing up there, son. I just wanted to watch the planes." Lamptey shrugged, taking a bite. Cynthia sighed, the sternness in her eyes softening. She understood her boy. He wasn't like the other kids in the neighborhood. Boys who spent their days playing basketball on cracked asphalt, dreaming of becoming the next big rapper. Lamptey dreamed of the sky. But Atlanta in the 1990s wasn't a place for impossible dreams, especially not for a black boy growing up in a poor neighborhood. Here, people spoke of survival, not ambition. Men like Charles drove buses, worked factory shifts, or, if they were lucky, landed jobs in service industries. Women like Cynthia cleaned houses or waited tables. No one had ever heard of a black pilot around here. And yet, when Lamptey looked up, the planes in the sky never asked who was in the cockpit. They only needed someone who could fly. At dinner, he voiced the thought that had long burned in his chest. "Mom, what if I became a pilot?" Cynthia's hand stilled for a fraction of a second before she looked at her husband. Charles kept chewing slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on his son just a bit longer than usual. "You want to be a pilot?" he finally asked, his voice laced with quiet disbelief. "Yes." A brief silence settled over the table. His mother smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried more sadness than encouragement. His father placed his chopsticks down, meeting Lamptey's gaze head-on. "Do you know how hard that is?" Lamptey nodded. He knew, but hard didn't mean impossible. "I don't care how hard it is. All I know is when I look at the sky, I feel like that's where I belong." Charles studied his son for a long moment before giving a slow nod. He said nothing more, but deep down he understood this wasn't the fleeting fantasy of a child. Lamptey meant it. That night, the boy climbed onto the roof once again. The night air was crisp against his skin, carrying the distant hum of the city. Another plane streaked across the dark expanse, leaving behind a faint silver trail. Lamptey took a deep breath. Someday I'll be up there, sitting behind the controls carrying people across the world. He didn't know how he'd do it, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to give up. The fluorescent light in the classroom flickered tiredly, humming with a low, uneven buzz. It was a slow autumn afternoon, and the air in the room had grown heavy with impatience. Just a few more minutes until the bell. 14-year-old Lamptey Williams sat hunched over his notebook, sketching with quiet intensity. But unlike his classmates, who doodled mindless scribbles in the margins of their textbooks, Lamptey was drafting the intricate details of an airplane cockpit. Panels of switches, levers, and glowing instrument displays, all drawn from the aviation books he had borrowed from the library. From behind him, a mocking voice broke the silence. "Hey Lamp, still drawing that nonsense? You really think you're going to be a pilot?" Lamptey lifted his head and met the gaze of Jamal, one of his classmates. A few others stood beside him, smirking. Yeah, why not? Lamptey asked calmly. Jamal let out a sharp laugh and shoved Lamptey's notebook onto the desk for everyone to see. Look around, man. Who do you think is going to hire you to fly a plane? You ever seen anyone from this neighborhood do that? Or do you think you're special? More laughter rippled through the room. Another boy chimed in, grinning. Guys like us? We don't belong in the sky. We stay on the ground. Lamptey's grip tightened around his pen. He knew they weren't entirely wrong. He had never seen anyone who looked like him sitting in a cockpit. But did that mean it was impossible? Just because no one's done it before doesn't mean I can't, he said, locking eyes with Jamal. Jamal scoffed, still grinning. Keep dreaming, Lamp. You'll figure it out one day. Lamptey didn't argue. He simply reached for his notebook, dusting off the faint smudges on the cover. His sketches were still there, each carefully drawn button and lever etched onto the page. He didn't need their approval. He knew what he wanted. That night, Lamptey sat cross-legged on the living room floor, his aviation books spread out before him. Page by page, he pored over the mechanics of flight, lift dynamics, and the controls pilots used to steer their planes. Every word on the page felt like a step closer to the sky. His father, Charles Williams, stepped out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee in hand. He paused when he saw the books sprawled across the floor, then took a seat beside his son. Still chasing that pilot dream? Yes. Charles took a slow sip of his coffee, then glanced at him thoughtfully. Rough day at school? Lamptey hesitated. A part of him wanted to brush off the question, but his father's patient gaze told him he already knew something was on his mind. The other kid said, I'll never be a pilot, Lamptey admitted. That people like me can't. Charles leaned back against the couch, staring into the dark liquid in his cup. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. You know, when I first started driving the bus, there were folks who wouldn't even get on, just because of the color of my skin. Lamptey blinked, startled. Really? His father nodded. For a while, I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong there. But then I realized if I quit, I'd just be proving them right. He set his coffee down and met his son's eyes. People will always tell you what you can't do, Lamptey, but it only becomes true if you start believing them. The words settled deep inside him. Later that night, as he turned back to his books, something had shifted. The sting of Jamal's laughter no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like fuel. He wouldn't prove anything to Jamal. He would prove it to himself. That summer, while other kids in the neighborhood spent their days lost in basketball games or pedaling old bikes through back alleys, Lamptey buried himself in books. He spent countless hours in the school library, devouring anything he could find about airplanes, from the principles of aerodynamics to the history of aviation. Each worn page unfolded a world where gravity was no longer a limit. Every time he read about the structure of a Boeing 747 or the cockpit layout of a small Cessna, he would pull out his pencil and sketch the diagrams on a scrap paper. Every button, every lever, every mechanical system etched into his memory as if he had already sat behind the controls himself. What are you doing, Lamp? Jamal, his classmate, peered over his shoulder during lunch break, eyes narrowing at the intricate technical drawings. I'm studying how to fly a plane, Lamptey replied without looking up. Jamal snorted, glancing at the pages filled with cockpit schematics. You serious? You think reading books is all it takes to become a pilot? Lamptey didn't answer. He was used to the doubt. One afternoon, on his way home from school, something caught his eye, a flyer taped to a bus stop. High school airport tour, a chance to explore aviation. His heart pounded. This could be his opportunity. That evening, he rushed home and told his parents about the program. Charles Williams took the flyer, reading it carefully before nodding. If you really want to go, I'll take you. Lamptey's face lit up. That morning, he dressed in the best clothes he owned and stepped into Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, eyes wide with awe. It was the first time he had ever been this close to real airplanes. The thunder of jet engines, the sharp scent of aviation fuel, the massive steel birds gliding across the runway. It was overwhelming, breathtaking. The student group was led through control rooms, passenger cabins, and even got a glimpse of a cockpit from a distance. But when Lamptey, voice brimming with hope, asked about internships or study programs, One of the airport staff members merely shook his head. This industry isn't easy, kid, especially if you don't have someone guiding you. Lamptey swallowed hard. So, how do I become a pilot? The man gave a small, dismissive chuckle. You're going to need a lot of money. Flight school isn't cheap. The words hit like a slap. Lamptey stood there, silent, staring at the planes preparing for takeoff outside. They were so close, and yet so impossibly far. Days later, unwilling to accept defeat, Lamptey decided to apply for an internship at the airport. He spent hours filling out applications, writing letters with every ounce of passion he had. But when he finally sat for an interview, the supervisor barely glanced at his paperwork before shaking his head. "This isn't the right path for you," the man said flatly. Lamptey's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" The supervisor simply shrugged, flipping through other applications. "We're looking for a different kind of background." A different kind of background. Lamptey left the office, an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. For the first time, he realized that this path wasn't just difficult. There were invisible walls standing in his way, ones he had never considered before. That night, he climbed onto the roof again, but this time he didn't dream. He just lay there, staring at the endless sky. He had tried. He had worked hard. So why did every door seem to slam shut in his face? His father stepped outside, wordless at first, then took a seat beside him. "Tough, isn't it?" Lamptey didn't answer. Charles took a deep breath, exhaling slowly before speaking. "You know, I once dreamed of being a mechanical engineer, but college was too expensive, so I drove a bus instead." Lamptey turned his head, surprised. Charles met his gaze. "Life doesn't always give us the road we want." His voice was steady, firm. "But that doesn't mean we can't find another way." Lamptey lay in silence for a long time. Then finally he nodded. He didn't know where this road would lead. But one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up. On Monday morning, Lamptey stood outside the towering office building of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. He took a deep breath, straightened the old button-down shirt his mother had carefully ironed the night before, and stepped inside. Today was his chance. He was here for an interview, an internship program for high school students. His first real opportunity to step into the world of aviation. He had spent hours the night before rehearsing answers in the mirror, imagining how he would convince the interviewers with his unwavering passion. But as soon as he entered the waiting room, reality felt different. The other applicants, most of them children of airline employees or students from elite private schools, stood around in crisp suits and polished shoes, talking with the effortless confidence of those who belonged. A few glanced his way, their eyes flickering with curiosity. For the first time, he felt out of place. After a long wait, a sharply dressed middle-aged man stepped out with a clipboard. "Lamptey Williams? Follow me." Lamptey swallowed hard, gripped his file a little tighter, and walked in. "You're not the right fit for a pilot." The interviewer, a man in his 50s with graying hair and thin, gold-rimmed glasses, flipped through Lamptey's paperwork with a detached expression. "So, you're applying for the airport internship program?" His voice was unreadable. "Yes, sir," Lamptey said, keeping his posture straight. "I've been passionate about aviation for as long as I can remember, and I want to learn more about the industry." The man studied him for a moment, then placed the file down. "Do you have any family in the industry?" Lamptey hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. But I've spent years studying on my own, reading about aircraft mechanics, cockpit systems, and—" "Your grades are fairly good," the man interrupted, though his tone lacked any real praise. "But we're looking for candidates with a stronger background." Lamptey frowned slightly. "What do you mean by that?" The man simply shrugged, flipping through the pages as if searching for a more palatable excuse to end the interview. Eventually, he folded his hands on the desk and met Lamptey's eyes. "You're not the right fit for a pilot. We need applicants with a different kind of background." The words sliced through him. Lamptey forced himself to stay composed. "But isn't this program meant for students who want to explore aviation?" The man nodded. "Yes, but aviation isn't an industry just anyone can step into, especially without the right connections or guidance. I'd suggest looking into something more practical." For the first time, Lamptey couldn't hide his disappointment. "So, You're saying only people who already know someone in the industry can have a future here. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he offered a small, knowing smile, the kind that told Lamptey this conversation was over. Thank you for your interest in the program. Best of luck to you. Lamptey stared at his file on the desk. He had spent days preparing for this. He had poured every ounce of hope into this interview, and all he got was a cold rejection. Slowly, he rose to his feet, bowed his head politely, and walked out. Was it all just a dream? By the time he stepped out of the building, his legs felt heavy. He had always known this path wouldn't be easy, but he never expected to be shut out before even getting a chance. Not because he lacked knowledge, not because he lacked determination, but simply because he wasn't the right kind of person. He stopped outside the airport gates, staring up at the massive planes slicing through the sky. They kept flying, shimmering under the golden sunlight. But what about him? For the first time, a quiet, suffocating doubt crept into his chest. Had he been chasing something that was never meant for him? Lamptey sat quietly in the corner of the living room, his gaze unfocused as he stared out the window. Ever since that crushing interview at the airport, he had felt as if an important door had slammed shut right in front of him. But he couldn't give up. If one path was blocked, he would find another. Determined, he turned to researching flight schools. If he couldn't start with an internship, he would go straight to training. He would become a pilot on his own. But as he scrolled through the outdated computer in the school library, his heart sank. $30,000 to $100,000 to complete commercial pilot training. Lamptey read the number again and again. Impossible. That was more money than his parents made in several years combined. He searched for alternatives. A few schools offered scholarships, but they were rare and fiercely competitive. The military had aviation programs, but they required years of service before he could even think about becoming a civilian pilot. Every path demanded something he didn't have: money, connections, or resources beyond his reach. That evening, when his father returned from work, Lamptey finally voiced the truth weighing on his heart. "Dad, I looked up the cost of flight training." Charles Williams sat down, wiping the sweat from his brow after another long shift behind the wheel. "Oh yeah? How much?" Lamptey hesitated. "At least $30,000. Silence filled the room. In the kitchen, his mother, Cynthia, paused in the middle of washing dishes, glancing at her husband. Charles exhaled heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Lamp, I don't want you to give up on your dream, but you know that's an impossible amount for us, right?" Of course he knew. He wasn't naive enough to think his parents could pull tens of thousands of dollars out of nowhere. But did that mean his dream would always be out of reach? Just because of money? "Then what can I do, Dad?" His voice was quieter now, as if he was afraid to hear the answer. Charles sat in thought for a moment before finally speaking. "You start with what you can do. Learn, work, save. You won't get everything all at once, but you can take it one step at a time." Lamptey nodded. It wasn't the solution he wanted, but his father was right. He couldn't afford to stand still. "If I don't have the money, I'll earn it." The next morning, Lamptey set out to find a job. He applied everywhere: grocery stores, fast food joints, gas stations. Finally, a small diner near the airport hired him as a kitchen assistant. The work was grueling. He spent hours on his feet, scrubbing dishes until his hands cracked, carrying heavy trays until his arms ached. But he didn't care. Every dollar he earned was a step closer to the cockpit. On weekends, he picked up extra shifts at a car wash, squeezing every spare hour into making money. Most nights, he came home so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open. But in his dreams, he still saw planes soaring through the sky, and he refused to let go of them. "You're wasting your time." Not everyone supported his determination. One afternoon, during lunch at school, he sat with his old group of friends. As he pulled a worn aviation book from his backpack, Jamal watched him with a skeptical expression. "Lamp, do you really think you can pull this off?" Lamptey frowned. "What do you mean?" Jamal shrugged. "I mean, you're killing yourself over some crazy dream. Have you ever seen anyone from our neighborhood become a pilot?" Others nodded in agreement. Another boy chimed in. "He's right. Look, I'm not trying to bring you down, but be real. Guys like us don't get those chances. You could be a mechanic, though. Working on planes is a good job." Lamptey tightened his grip on the book. He had heard these words too many times before. He knew they weren't trying to crush his spirit. They were just saying what they believed to be true, what life had taught them. But he refused to accept that truth. "I don't want to fix planes," he said, his voice steady. "I want to fly them." Jamal shook his head and let out a dry laugh. "All right, man, keep dreaming. But one day, you'll see I was right." Lamptey didn't argue. Instead, he turned to the window, watching as a plane lifted off into the sky. No matter what anyone said, he wasn't stopping. 3 months had passed, and Lamptey had grown accustomed to the relentless rhythm of his days. School in the morning, work at the diner in the evening, car washes on the weekends. Every dollar he earned went into a small wooden box hidden beneath his bed. It was nowhere near enough for flight school tuition, but at least he was doing something. At least he was trying. But not every day went smoothly. One late night, after an unexpectedly long shift, Lamptey dragged himself home. His hands ached from scrubbing too many dishes. His back throbbed from standing for 6 straight hours. He was exhausted, bone-tired. As soon as he stepped into the house, he collapsed into a chair in the living room, his head dropping onto the table. His mother emerged from the kitchen and let out a quiet sigh at the sight of him. "Lamptey, you're wearing yourself down." He didn't answer right away. He knew she was worried. But if he stopped now, then what? If he didn't push himself, who else would do it for him? Mrs. Cynthia sat beside him, gently running a hand through his hair. "I know what you want, Lamp, but you need to rest too." "I can't stop, Mom." His voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "I don't have time to rest." She didn't argue. After a moment of silence, she stood up, went into the kitchen, and returned with a small box. She placed it in front of him. "This is what I can do for you." Confused, Lamptey slowly opened the box. Inside was a neat stack of worn bills. His eyes widened. "Mom, where did this come from?" She smiled softly. "It's what I saved from my extra shifts. I always wanted to set something aside for you and your sister, just in case. And right now, I think you need it more than anyone." Lamptey stared at the money, speechless. He knew his mother didn't have much. This may have been just a fraction of what he needed for flight school, but to her, it was a sacrifice. His throat tightened. "Mom, I can't take this. It's yours." Mrs. Cynthia took his hand in hers, her grip firm, unwavering. "Lamp, my son, listen to me. If this dream is what you truly want, I won't let you chase it alone." Lamptey's eyes burned. He had heard so many rejections, so much doubt. But for the first time, someone other than himself believed he could do this. Not long after, Lamptey had a conversation with his father. That evening, Mr. Charles sat on the porch, sipping his coffee after a long day of driving. Lamptey stepped outside and sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The night air was filled with the soft hum of crickets. Finally, Mr. Charles broke the silence. "Your mother told me about the money." Lamptey lowered his head. "I told her I couldn't take it." His father nodded slowly, then placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Lamp, I can't pave the road for you, but I can make sure you don't walk it alone." Lamptey turned to his father, eyes wide with surprise. "Dad, I don't have much money." His father smiled faintly. "But I can take on extra hours. I can find ways to support you. If you're ready to fight for this dream, then I'll fight alongside you." Lamptey could hardly believe what he was hearing. His father had always been the practical one, the one who worried about what would happen if he failed. But right now, he was saying that he believed in him. "I'll help you, but you have to promise me one thing." "What is it?" "If you're really going to do this, then don't give up halfway." Lamptey clenched his fists. "I promise." That night, like so many nights before, Lamptey climbed onto the roof, his usual place for thinking. But this time, something felt different. There were still countless challenges ahead. Tuition was still an enormous hurdle. He still had no idea how he would break into the aviation world. But at least he wasn't alone anymore. The cool night breeze ruffled his hair. Above him, an airplane soared through the sky, its lights blinking in the darkness. One day, he would be the one sitting in that cockpit. And this time, he knew he would make it. The chime of the wind bell rang softly as Lamptey pushed open the door to the small diner near the airport. He had been working here for nearly 3 months, a job that was anything but easy. But at least it gave him a paycheck. And more importantly, it kept him close to the thing he longed for most. The runway, the planes, the sky. He quickly tied his apron, adjusted his cap, and stepped out to arrange the tables. Today's shift seemed quieter than usual, with only a few customers sipping their morning coffee. But one man caught his attention. An older gentleman, dark-skinned, his hair streaked with silver, sat alone in the corner. He wasn't like the hurried passengers rushing to catch flights, nor did he resemble the young pilots who occasionally stopped by. He simply sat there, stirring his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the endless rise and fall of airplanes beyond the glass. Lamptey studied him quietly while wiping down the counter. He didn't know why, but there was something different about him. "Do you like planes?" Lost in thought, Lamptey barely noticed the deep, steady voice cutting through the air. "You like planes, don't you?" Startled, he turned around. The older man was watching him over the rim of his thin-framed glasses. Lamptey scratched the back of his head, embarrassed. Yes, sir." The man nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I figured. You've been looking out there the whole time." Lamptey flushed. He hadn't realized it was so obvious. But instead of brushing it off, like he usually did with other customers, he decided to be honest. "I've always wanted to be a pilot, sir." But he hesitated. "It's not an easy path." The man set his coffee down, crossing his arms. "So, what have you done to chase it?" A simple question, yet it hit Lamptey like a hammer to the chest. He had done many things, read books, worked to save money, searched for opportunities, but the truth was he had yet to touch anything directly related to aviation. "I haven't had the chance. Opportunities don't just fall into people's laps, kid." The man smiled knowingly. "They come to those who seek them." Lamptey studied him closely. He wasn't like the others. He didn't scoff, didn't doubt, didn't tell him his dream was impossible. "Were you a pilot, sir?" The man nodded slowly. "My name's Henry Davis. I flew for over 30 years. Retired a few years back." Lamptey froze. A real pilot, sitting right in front of him. He could hardly believe his luck. Would you mind if I asked you a few things about aviation?" Mr. Davis chuckled. "Why do you think I'm sitting here?" Lamptey pulled up a chair, momentarily forgetting he was still on shift. "Do you really want to fly?" They talked for half an hour. Lamptey spoke about his dream, about the obstacles in his way, about the times he had been turned away simply because of where he came from. Mr. Davis listened patiently, nodding every so often. When Lamptey finally stopped, the older man took a slow sip of his coffee before asking, "So, will you give up?" "Never." This time, Lamptey answered without hesitation. Mr. Davis was quiet for a moment, then said slowly, "Come see me this Saturday morning. If you're truly serious about becoming a pilot, I'll help you get started." Lamptey's eyes widened. "For real? You'll teach me?" Mr. Davis smiled. "I'll show you the way, but you'll have to walk it yourself." As Mr. Davis got up to leave, Lamptey sat there stunned. He couldn't believe it. For the first time in his life, someone wasn't just believing in him. They were willing to help him move forward. His father's words echoed in his mind. They might block one road, but you can always find another. Maybe this was the road he had been searching for. That night, as he walked home, a wide grin spread across his face. A new chapter of his journey had just begun. Saturday morning, Lamptey stood before the worn iron gate of a small house, not far from the airport. His heart pounded harder than ever. Mr. Henry Davis had told him to be there at exactly 8 a.m. Now there were only 2 minutes left. Taking a deep breath, Lamptey straightened his shirt and pressed the doorbell. A moment later, the door swung open. Mr. Davis appeared, his expression just as calm and composed as the first time they met. "You're on time." "Good." He gave a small nod, then turned back inside. "Come in." Lamptey followed him in. The living room was simple, but the walls were lined with certificates, medals, and framed photographs. One picture in particular caught his eye, Mr. Davis standing in front of a massive Boeing 747, the caption below reading, "Captain Henry Davis, 30 years in the sky." Lamptey froze. He wasn't just a pilot. He had been a captain, a man who had spent thousands of hours in the air. Turning back to Mr. Davis, Lamptey's eyes shone with admiration. "I've never met anyone with this much flying experience before." Experience doesn't matter as much as what you can learn from it. Mr. Davis's voice was steady. Now, let's see what you can learn. A lesson in the sky. Mr. Davis led him into a small room. In the center was a large wooden table covered with aviation maps, flight manuals, and a model aircraft control panel. Lamptey swallowed hard. This was the first time he had ever seen these things in real life, things he had only read about in books. Sit down, Mr. Davis instructed, pointing to the chair across from him. Lamptey quickly obeyed. What do you think a pilot needs to know? Lamptey thought for a moment, then answered confidently. How to control the plane, take off, land. Wrong. Mr. Davis cut him off. A great pilot isn't just someone who knows how to fly a plane. It's someone who understands the sky. Lamptey blinked, not fully grasping his meaning. Mr. Davis unfolded a large aviation chart in front of him. This is an air route map. You can be up there flying, but if you don't know where you're going, you're no different from being lost in the middle of the ocean. He began explaining how to read flight maps, the critical symbols, the air corridors, and the unbreakable rules of navigating through controlled airspace. At first, it was overwhelming, too much information, too many technical details. But as Mr. Davis went on, piece by piece, it all started to make sense. Lamptey realized that flying wasn't just about handling the aircraft. It was about understanding an entire system that connected the sky to the ground. The real test. After nearly 2 hours of studying maps and flight principles, Mr. Davis crossed his arms and looked at him. Good. You learned fast. Lamptey smiled, proud of how much he had absorbed. But his smile faded when Mr. Davis continued. Now let's start over. What? I need to see if you truly understand, or if you're just memorizing. Mr. Davis took away the old map and placed a new one in front of him. Find me a flight route from Atlanta to New York. Tell me which airspaces you'll pass through and the optimal altitude. Lamptey stared at the map. It wasn't the same as the one before, but he knew he couldn't back down. He had to prove he could do this. 10 minutes later, he handed over his notes. Mr. Davis studied them silently. Then he gave a slight nod. Not bad, but not fast enough. Lamptey felt a pang of disappointment, but instead of feeling discouraged, he clenched his fists. Then, how do I get faster? Mr. Davis smiled. Now that's the right question. A new chapter. By the time the lesson ended, Lamptey's brain felt like it was about to explode from all the new information. But at the same time, he felt thrilled. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just dreaming about aviation. He was learning it. Before he left, Mr. Davis said something he would never forget. I can teach you, but only you can decide if you have the determination to see it through. Lamptey met his gaze, then nodded firmly. I won't quit. Mr. Davis chuckled, as if he had been expecting that answer. Then come back next Saturday and bring a new notebook. For what? You'll need it to write down everything I teach you, because this is just the beginning, one step closer to the sky. As Lamptey stepped out of Mr. Davis's house, a newfound confidence burned inside him. Today he had taken a real step toward the sky, and he knew this was only the start of something much bigger. Saturday mornings with Henry Davis. Saturday mornings with Mr. Henry Davis quickly became a familiar rhythm in Lamptey's life. Every week, he arrived on time, carrying the new notebook Mr. Davis had asked him to bring. At first, he thought it was just for jotting down basic aviation knowledge. But he soon realized that what Mr. Davis was truly teaching him wasn't just theory. It was the mindset of a pilot. Anyone can learn to fly a plane, but not everyone can become a pilot, Mr. Davis had said. The lessons were rigorous. He gave Lamptey exercises on emergency scenarios, understanding how weather affected flights, calculating fuel consumption for different routes. Every session demanded absolute focus and mental resilience. There were times when Lamptey felt like his brain was overheating from absorbing too much information at once. But every time he thought about all the rejections he had faced, he clenched his jaw and pushed through. And Mr. Davis noticed. One morning, after Lamptey had just finished mapping out a flight route, Mr. Davis looked at him thoughtfully and asked, "Have you ever heard of the Minority Youth Aviation Scholarship?" Lamptey's head shot up, eyes flickering with hope. "I looked into it once, but I heard it's nearly impossible to get." Mr. Davis nodded. "It's difficult, yes, but not impossible. and I think you have a shot." He pulled open a drawer, took out an application form, and slid it across the table. "This is a scholarship from an organization that supports minority youth pursuing aviation. They don't just cover tuition for theory courses. They also provide hands-on training with real aircraft. I think you should apply." Lamptey picked up the form, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. This was an opportunity he had never dared to believe was within reach. But he also knew hundreds of others would be applying. Was he good enough? As if reading his thoughts, Mr. Davis said, "Don't underestimate yourself. I've met a lot of pilots in my lifetime, and I know who is what it takes to become one." His gaze was steady. "You have it, Lamptey." For the first time, someone told him outright that he had potential. Lamptey gripped the application tighter, took a deep breath, and nodded. "I'll try." The next week, Lamptey poured every spare moment into preparing his application. He had to write an essay explaining why he wanted to become a pilot, list his academic achievements, and submit letters of recommendation. Without hesitation, Mr. Davis wrote him a powerful recommendation letter. "I don't just see a boy with a dream. I see someone willing to do whatever it takes to make it a reality. He deserves this chance." A month after submitting his application, an email arrived from the selection committee. "Congratulations. You have been selected for an in-person interview." Lamptey stared at the screen, unable to breathe. He had made it. Out of hundreds of applicants, he had earned a spot in the interview round. But this was only the first step. He still had to prove himself. On the day of the interview, Lamptey dressed in the best button-up shirt he owned and clutched his folder tightly as he walked into the waiting room. The other candidates looked polished, confident, some even wearing full suits. His pulse quickened, but then he remembered what Mr. Davis had once told him. Confidence doesn't mean you're never afraid. Confidence means you know you've prepared enough to face that fear. When his name was called, he took a deep breath and stepped into the interview room. 3 panelists sat before him, flipping through his application. A middle-aged man leaned forward. "So, Lamptey," he said, "why do you want to be a pilot?" This was the question he had asked himself 1,000 times. He looked him straight in the eye and answered without hesitation. "Because I know the sky has no limits. And neither do I." A week after the interview, a letter from the organization arrived. Hands trembling, Lamptey tore it open, his heart pounding so loudly it nearly drowned out the words in front of him. "Congratulations. You have been awarded a scholarship for aviation theory training." He did it. A shout of joy burst from his lips. He grabbed the letter and ran straight to Mr. Davis's house. When the old pilot opened the door, Lamptey held up the letter, eyes shining. Mr. Davis studied him for a moment, then smiled with quiet pride. "Well done, kid." His voice was firm. "But this is only the beginning. Now, prove to them that they chose the right person." Lamptey clutched the letter tightly. He had been given a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Lamptey stood at the gates of the flight academy, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. Dressed in the deep blue uniform of a cadet, his bag slung over one shoulder, he finally felt like he had stepped into the world he had always dreamed of. But alongside the exhilaration, a creeping unease settled in his chest. He had no idea what awaited him inside. Not everyone is meant for this profession. The large auditorium buzzed with the murmurs of new cadets. The air was thick with anticipation. Lamptey sat at the very back, observing the others. Most of them were white, carrying themselves with the effortless confidence of those who had known aviation all their lives. Some bragged about their fathers or uncles being pilots, as if their destinies had already been written in the sky. He took a deep breath. There was no one else like him here. A middle-aged man with graying hair stepped onto the stage. Captain Richard Coleman, the chief instructor. His gaze swept across the room, sharp and penetrating, as if he could read the thoughts of every cadet before him. "Welcome to the Flight Academy." His voice was deep, steady but unyielding. "You've beaten out hundreds of applicants to earn your place here. But don't let that fool you into thinking you've accomplished anything yet." Silence fell over the auditorium. Not everyone is cut out for this job. If you don't have what it takes, it's better to walk away now. His eyes lingered on Lamptey for a brief moment before moving on. "We don't train the best on paper. We train those who can handle the pressure." Those who can take control of an aircraft when everything goes to hell. If you can't, then leave now. No one moved. Lamptey swallowed hard. He wasn't going anywhere. But even from this first moment, he could feel the weight of this place pressing down on him. As the orientation ended, cadets began dispersing, heading toward their assigned classrooms. Lamptey had barely stepped out of the auditorium when a voice sounded behind him. "So, you're Lamptey Williams?" He turned around. A tall, blonde-haired young man stood in front of him, his smile edged with something unreadable. "Ryan Caldwell. You got it on a scholarship, didn't you?" Ryan asked, arms crossed. "Yeah, so what?" Ryan smirked. "So, you're here for diversity quotas, not because you're actually good?" Lamptey's hands clenched into fists. He'd heard these words before, too many times. "If I wasn't good, I wouldn't be here." Ryan shrugged, as if unimpressed. "We'll see." He turned and walked away. Lamptey stood still, forcing himself to keep his emotions in check. He already knew he would have to prove himself twice as hard as the others. But no matter what, he wouldn't let words like these shake him. The first theory class took place in a large room, a massive screen displaying the diagram of an aircraft engine. The instructor launched into a lecture on aerodynamics. Lamptey found himself completely absorbed, meticulously jotting down every detail. But when he glanced around, most of the other cadets weren't even taking notes. Some already knew all of this. Others were so self-assured they didn't think they needed to study at all. During the break, he tried to strike up a conversation with the group next to him. "What do you guys think of the lecture?" One of them shrugged. "Nothing new. My dad's a pilot. I grew up with his stuff." Lamptey forced a smile. He had never had anyone to teach him before. Everything here was new to him, and he was starting to realize he was the only one who had to work twice as hard just to keep up. After class, he stayed behind to ask the instructor a few extra questions about aerodynamics. Instructor Coleman studied him, his expression unreadable. "You seem very eager." "Yes, sir. I want to make sure I understand everything." He nodded, but his tone remained cool. "Diligence is commendable, but working hard doesn't mean you have what it takes." Lamptey frowned. "What do you mean?" Coleman regarded him for a long moment before speaking slowly, deliberately. "I've seen many come here full of passion, but aviation isn't for everyone. Some people, no matter how hard they try, just aren't cut out for it." A chill ran down Lamptey's spine. Those words weren't just a warning. They were a message. Even the instructors doubted him. "I'll prove you wrong," he said firmly. Coleman raised an eyebrow, as if he had heard those words too many times before. "We'll see." His voice was neutral, almost indifferent. "Soon enough, we'll know if you truly belong here." That night, Lamptey lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The first day was over, and he had already learned something important. No one here believed he would make it. They were all waiting for him to fail. But he hadn't come here to give up. He was going to prove them all wrong. The sky was a flawless shade of blue, untouched by a single cloud. But within Lamptey, a storm was brewing. Today marked the first flight simulation exercise, the moment when every cadet would finally put theory into practice. For those who had grown up around aviation, this was just another step in a long journey. But for someone like Lamptey, who had never even touched a cockpit's controls, this was his chance to prove he belonged here. When the pairings were announced, his heart sank. Ryan Caldwell. Of course. Ryan smirked, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he sauntered over. "Let's just hope you don't crash us straight into the ground." Lamptey said nothing. He couldn't afford to let Ryan, or anyone else, see him falter. Seated inside the simulator, he forced himself to stay calm. The switches, the displays, the yoke, everything looked just like a real aircraft. He mentally replayed every lesson from Mr. Henry Davis, every note he had meticulously taken on takeoff procedures. Deep breath. Focus. You can do this. Cadet Williams, proceed. The instructor's voice crackled through the headset. Lamptey nodded, pushing the throttle forward. Speed increasing. 50 knots. 60 knots. He pulled back on the yoke. A deafening alarm shrieked through the cabin. Stall! Stall! The warning screen flashed red. The aircraft was losing lift. He had pulled up too soon. The simulator shook violently. Ryan jolted, eyes wide with shock. "What the hell are you doing?" Lamptey panicked, trying to correct, but it was too late. On the screen, the aircraft wobbled, then plunged straight into the runway. Crash. Silence. No one spoke. The instructor studied the screen, then exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You pulled too early. If this were a real flight, you would have killed everyone on board." The cold, brutal words sliced through him like a blade. He had failed. On his very first try. Ryan leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Told you. You don't have what it takes." After that disastrous exercise, everything changed. The other cadets began to keep their distance. They no longer chatted with him, no longer offered to go over coursework together. He could feel their stares as he walked past, some doubtful, some pitying, and others worse, filled with ridicule. Even in the cafeteria, when he sat down, a few cadets stood up and left. Ryan didn't let up. "You should start considering other careers, Lamptey. Ground control? Aircraft maintenance? Something where you don't actually have to touch the controls." Lamptey clenched his fists. He knew that if he lashed out, Ryan would only have more ammunition to use against him. No, he had to prove them wrong through action. But the most painful thing was the doubt from his own instructor. That afternoon, Instructor Coleman summoned him to his office. He sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Cadet Williams, I need you to be honest with me." Lamptey straightened. "Yes, sir." Coleman laced his fingers together, his tone slow and deliberate. "Do you truly believe you belong here?" A chill ran down Lamptey's spine. "Are you saying I don't have what it takes, sir?" Coleman didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his words were razor sharp. "I've seen many come here with passion, but passion isn't enough. Not everyone is meant to be a pilot." It wasn't just a warning. It was a sign. "I don't want you wasting your time or hours." A storm raged inside Lamptey. "I've fought so hard for this, and this is what I get." He inhaled deeply, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You don't think I can do it, sir?" Coleman studied him for a long moment before replying. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself." That night, for the first time, Lamptey considered quitting. He stood on the dormitory balcony, staring up at the star-strewn sky. "I've come this far, but maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." Almost without thinking, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over a familiar number. Henry Davis. He pressed call. The line clicked. "Hello." Mr. Davis's voice was as steady as ever. But this time, Lamptey's throat tightened. "I don't think I can do this." A long silence. Then Mr. Davis spoke, his voice measured calm. "Lamptey, did you come here to prove them right or to prove them wrong?" Lamptey didn't answer. He didn't know. "How much did you sacrifice to be here? How hard did you work? Have those other cadets ever had to fight for their dreams the way you have?" Lamptey's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't know if I'm good enough." "Listen to me. You're going to fail. Not once, many times. But if you let one failure break you, then they're right. You don't belong here." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Mr. Davis was right. He couldn't give up. He took a deep breath and looked up at the sky once more. This time, his gaze wasn't filled with doubt. He was going to fight. The dormitory was quieter than usual that night. Lamptey sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the distant planes preparing to land on the illuminated runway. They flew on, moving precisely as they should, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. One question consumed his mind. Was he chasing an impossible dream? From the moment he set foot in flight school, he had known this path would be unforgiving. But he hadn't expected the doubt to come from everywhere, from his classmates, from his instructors, and worst of all, from himself. He had failed too many times. Faulty takeoffs, botched landings, losing control during emergency simulations. To the instructors, he was nothing more than a cadet with no potential, someone who simply didn't belong. He pulled out his phone. Almost instinctively, his fingers dialed Henry Davis's number. A deep, steady voice answered on the other end. "Hello." For a long moment, Lamptey said nothing. He didn't know where to start. "I don't think I can do this." His voice came out hoarse, thick with disappointment. Silence. No comforting words. No empty reassurances. Did you fail? Davis finally asked, his tone calm. More than fail. I think I don't belong here. A sigh drifted through the receiver. Then Davis spoke again, his words weighted, deliberate. Lamptey, did you come here to prove them right? Or to prove them wrong? Lamptey gripped the phone tighter. The question hit like a bell ringing in his mind. How much have you given up to be here? How hard have you worked? Do you think those other cadets know what sacrifice really means? Lamptey fell silent. Memories flooded back. Of a boy lying on a rooftop, watching planes streak across the sky. Of long nights spent buried in aviation textbooks at the library. Of endless shifts scrubbing dishes and washing cars, saving every last dollar for this dream. I don't know if I'm good enough. Listen to me. You will fail. Not just once, many times. But if you let one failure break you, then you're right. You don't belong there. The word struck like a slap to his pride. He had grown used to others doubting him, but he had never allowed himself to doubt himself. Yet tonight he had. I was just like you once, Lamptey. He froze. What? I was once called into an office and told I wasn't good enough to be a pilot. I was laughed at by my peers. I nearly quit. Lamptey held his breath. Davis had never spoken about this before. But if I had given up back then, do you think you'd be calling me Captain Henry Davis today? A chill ran down Lamptey's spine. Davis had been in his shoes. He had been underestimated, dismissed. He had fought to prove he belonged. Lamp, you don't have to be great right now. You just have to be better than the person you were yesterday. Stop comparing yourself to them. Start proving to yourself that you can do this. Lamptey closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. Thank you, sir. I don't need your thanks. I need you to prove that I wasn't wrong to believe in you. The call ended, but Davis's words still echoed in his mind. Lamptey looked up at the sky. He didn't know if he would succeed, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He wouldn't quit. The vast flight simulation room was bathed in the cold glow of control screens, their light reflecting off the tense faces of the cadets. Today was the final practical exam, the test that would determine who would continue on the path to becoming a pilot and who would be cut from the program. Lamptey stood in line, his fists clenched. He had failed too many times before. If he made another mistake today, the only door to his dream could slam shut forever. The roster was announced. Ryan Caldwell was up first. He strode into the simulator with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing you were the best. From day one, everyone knew Ryan was the top candidate. He had prior flight training, a father who was a pilot, and a spotless record in every practice session. The cadets watched on the large screen as Ryan took off flawlessly, maintaining perfect balance, executing each maneuver with textbook precision. Not a single error. Finally, he landed with effortless grace, his face betraying not even a hint of strain. As expected, flawless, someone muttered. Ryan stepped out of the cockpit, shrugging as if it had been nothing more than a routine drill. He glanced at Lamptey and smirked. Good luck, Williams. You'll need it. Lamptey inhaled deeply. He didn't need luck. He needed to be flawless. His name was called. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. The cadet who had failed again and again. They expected another disaster. They were waiting for a mistake. But he wasn't. Sliding into the seat, he placed his hands on the controls. He took a steadying breath, recalling every lesson from Mr. Davis, every night of practice, every past failure. Begin, the instructor's voice crackled through the intercom. Take off. No trembling hands this time. Every motion was precise. The aircraft surged forward down the runway, hitting 65 knots, and he pulled back on the controls. Perfect. No alarms. No stall. Warning like last time. The plane lifted into the sky, smooth and steady. The test continued through navigation and flight maneuvers. Everything was going according to plan. Then, suddenly, Instructor Coleman's eyes darkened as he studied the control panel. We're adding an extra test. Cadet Williams, handle this situation. An alarm blared. Engine failure. Engine failure. A simulated engine failure. The ultimate trial. The room erupted in murmurs. Most cadets only had to complete the standard test, but Lamptey had just been thrown into an emergency scenario. Ryan scoffed. Let's see how he handles this. But inside the cockpit, Lamptey didn't panic. He remembered Mr. Davis's words. In an emergency, you don't have time to be afraid. You only have time to act. Step by step, he executed the procedure. Cut the throttle to reduce speed. Adjust the flaps to minimize drag. Search for an emergency landing site. Attempt engine restart. No mistakes. In just 30 seconds, he regained control, stabilizing the aircraft. The room was dead silent. No one had expected him to pull it off. He guided the plane down, landing precisely on the runway, flawless. When he stepped out of the cockpit, the sneers were gone. Ryan was no longer smirking. He stared at Lamptey, but this time, there was nothing left to mock. Because Lamptey had just done what he never had. Instructor Coleman eyed him, then gave a slow nod. I didn't think you could do it, but it seems I was wrong. It wasn't exactly praise. But to Lamptey, it meant more than any compliment, because it meant he belonged here. As he stepped out of the simulator room, the golden afternoon light streamed through the windows. He took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Today he had done what no one thought he could. Today he had proven them wrong. And this was only the beginning. The crisp new pilot uniform lay neatly on the bed. On the chest pocket, a small insignia gleamed under the light, the words First Officer L. Williams stitched in perfect precision. Lamptey stood before the mirror, drawing in a deep breath. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times before, and now it was real. Slowly, he reached out, fastening each button with deliberate care, straightening his tie, then slipping on the black airline jacket with its gleaming emblem. As he placed the pilot's cap on his head, the reflection staring back at him no longer looked like the boy who once lay on a rooftop, dreaming of the sky. Today, he wasn't looking up at the sky with wishful longing. Today, he was the one guiding it. The airport bustled with life, the early morning sun casting golden light across the endless runway. Lamptey walked forward, his small suitcase rolling behind him, heading toward the waiting Boeing 737. Ground crew moved past him. Engines roared in the distance. Yet in his mind, everything was silent. This wasn't a simulation. This wasn't another test. This was real. Stepping into the cockpit, a familiar yet electrifying sensation coursed through him. Everything he had learned, every sleepless night, every failure, every moment he picked himself back up, had all led to this. Taking his seat as first officer, he placed his hands on the control panel. The buttons, switches, and throttles before him felt less like instruments and more like old friends welcoming him home. No instructor stood behind him. No skeptical voices loomed over his shoulder. Today, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The captain, a composed, middle-aged man, glanced at him, a knowing smile on his lips. First time in the real skies, Williams? Lamptey nodded, steadying his voice. Yes, Captain. Good. I was in your seat once too. Remember this, you don't control the plane. You guide it. That reminder brought back the words of Henry Davis. Don't try to control the sky. Learn to understand it. Lamptey tightened his grip on the yoke. He was ready. The cockpit lights flickered. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. Flight 682, cleared for takeoff. Runway 27R? The captain turned to him, nodding once. Would you like to take the honors, Williams? Lamptey's heart pounded. He knew what this meant. It was a tradition, a gesture of trust. The captain was offering him the honor of his first real takeoff. He swallowed hard, then slowly replied, Yes, Captain. Then take us to the skies. Placing his hand on the throttle, he pushed it forward. The engines roared to life, the aircraft trembling as it surged down the runway. 80 knots, 100 knots. Wind rushed past the windows, the runway blurring beneath them. As they reached rotation speed, Lamptey pulled back on the controls. The nose lifted, and then the wheels left the ground. They had taken off. Lamptey looked out the window, the world below shrinking, roads and buildings now mere specks on the vast earth. He breathed in deeply, his heart soaring along with the aircraft. Years ago, he had looked up at the sky with a foolish dream. Today, the sky was where he belonged. As they reached cruising altitude, the captain turned to him, with an approving nod. "Well done, Williams. How does it feel?" Lamptey gazed outside. Beneath them, the clouds floated like islands in a vast blue ocean. He didn't answer right away. There were too many emotions to put into words. He thought of the countless nights in the library, the grueling shifts at the diner, the laughter of those who doubted him, the moments he almost walked away. He thought of his parents, of Henry Davis, of the people who had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. They were right. He belonged here. Lamptey turned back to the captain, a radiant smile breaking across his face. "It's incredible, Captain." The captain grinned. "Then welcome to the sky." Lamptey exhaled, steady and sure, as he looked out once more. This wasn't just a flight. It was the beginning of something far greater. And he knew this journey was only taking off. Years later, Lamptey had become a full-fledged pilot, logging thousands of hours in the sky. From domestic flights to international routes, through stormy nights and cloudless horizons, he had mastered the very space he once only dreamed of. But the more he flew, the more he realized a painful truth. On every flight, in every airline meeting, in every pilot training session, he hardly ever saw someone who looked like him. He remembered the struggles he had faced, the doubt, the prejudice, the financial roadblocks. He had carved his own path in an industry where no one had ever shown him how to begin. And he wondered how many others out there shared the same dream but had no idea where to start. He couldn't change his past, but he could help change someone else's future. On a clear afternoon, in a small office, Lamptey put pen to paper. That day, his nonprofit organization was officially born. Its name, Wings for the Future. Its mission was simple: provide scholarships for underprivileged youth who dreamed of becoming pilots but lacked the financial means. Organize workshops and mentorship programs to guide them through the aviation industry. Connect them with experienced pilots, just as Henry Davis had once done for him. Lamptey didn't want to fly alone. He wanted to hold the door open for those who came after him. And within a year, his organization had its first students. At one of the workshops, he stood before a group of young, eager faces that reminded him of his younger self. Eyes filled with the same longing for the sky, yet clouded with uncertainty on how to reach it. "I was once in your shoes," he said, his voice steady. "I heard people say I wasn't good enough. But let me tell you this, the sky doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you have the determination to reach it." A young boy in the front row hesitantly raised his hand. "But how do we even start?" he asked. "I don't have anyone to guide me. I don't have the money to learn." Lamptey stepped down, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked him straight in the eyes. "You don't need to have everything right away," he said. "You just need one thing: to never give up." The boy nodded, a spark of hope flickering in his gaze. Lamptey smiled. He knew he was on the right path. One evening, Lamptey received an invitation to an aviation conference, a prestigious event where pilots, engineers, and industry leaders gathered. As he stepped into the grand hall, surrounded by accomplished professionals, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "So, you really did it?" Lamptey turned. Ryan Caldwell stood there, still tall, still composed, but something in his eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone. For a moment, they just looked at each other, memories of flight school flashing between them. Lamptey smirked. "I told you I'd prove you wrong." Ryan exhaled, nodding slowly. "You didn't just prove me wrong," he said. "You did something I never even thought possible." Lamptey frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan gestured toward the large banner across the room. The Wings for the Future logo displayed proudly for all to see. "You didn't just become a great pilot. You changed the entire game." For the first time, Ryan Caldwell was no longer a rival. He was someone who had finally admitted that Lamptey had done what no one expected, and that meant more than any victory. Lamptey extended his hand. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, then clasped it firmly. They were no longer two competitors. They were two pilots, two men who had forged their own paths. And Lamptey knew his journey was far from over. The sky over Atlanta was a perfect shade of blue, with soft, white clouds drifting lazily above the airport. In one corner of the airfield, A group of young students from Wings for the Future gathered eagerly, hanging on to every word of their aviation lesson. Standing among them, Lamptey still wore his crisp pilot's uniform, but he was no longer the young man struggling to prove himself. Today, he was the one opening doors for those who would come after him. A boy, no more than 14, with short curls and eyes full of hope, raised his hand. "Mr. Lamptey, did you ever think you wouldn't make it as a pilot?" The question made him smile. He remembered everything. Those days spent staring up at the sky, dreaming of something that felt impossibly far away. The long nights buried in aviation books at the library, the mockery, the failures, the crushing moments in flight school when he nearly gave up. He knelt down so he could meet the boy's gaze, resting a steady hand on his shoulder. "I doubted myself. I failed. But there's one thing I never did," he said, his voice firm. "I never gave up." The boy's eyes widened, absorbing every word. "People might say you're not good enough, but they don't get to decide who you are. Only you can decide that." A flicker of determination lit up the boy's face. "I want to fly, just like you." Lamptey glanced up at the vast, open sky and smiled. "Then one day, I'll be a passenger on your flight." As the session ended and the students began to leave, Lamptey lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the endless stretch of runway before him. A plane roared to life, surging forward before lifting off, its white contrail cutting through the deep blue sky. He took a deep breath. He had come so far, but he knew this was not the end, because somewhere out there, another child was looking up at the sky with a dream in their eyes, just as he once had. And now he was here, not just to fly, but to help them take flight too. The sky has no limits, and this journey was far from over. Lamptey's story is not just about becoming a pilot. It is a testament to perseverance, defying expectations, and carving out one's own path. In life, we all face obstacles, whether it's financial hardship, the doubt of others, or the fears that live within us. But as Lamptey proved, ability is not something we are simply born with. It is forged through failure, sharpened by resilience, and strengthened by relentless effort. So keep pushing forward, seek out opportunities, and most importantly, believe in yourself. The sky does not discriminate. It only waits for those who are ready to take flight. Do you believe that determination can turn dreams into reality? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring real-life stories.